This last module will be on the accommodations and modifications that teachers and school personnel can utilize while with a child that has hearing loss in the classroom. Because once appropriate amplification is assured, then accommodations and modifications can be made to utilize with this child. These slides and the information from this module is credited to Donna Smiley to an outstanding presentation that she gave February 24th, 2016 on Help, I Have a Student with Hearing Loss. So the majority of this next module will be coming from her work. Now, what's the difference between accommodations and modifications? Accommodations are provisions for how a student accesses information and demonstrates their learning, demonstrates that they have mastered this information. It also includes technology such as FM systems in the classroom. There's no substantial change to the instructional level, to the content presented to the student, or even the performance criteria from the student. It's more of access and making information accessible to them that's accessible to normal hearing peers. It provides the students with that equal access to the learning and to the opportunities to demonstrate that they have learned and mastered the material. Modifications, however, are substantial changes to what either the student is expected to learn or how they demonstrate that they know that learning. For example, perhaps they demonstrate it by, rather than a written test, they may have a verbal test. It provides students the opportunity to participate meaningfully and productively in the learning experiences as well as those same environments of the classroom that their normal hearing peers have experience with and participate in. We will start with general accommodations for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. There are several different categories of accommodations. You'll look at each category and then decide within that category what types of strategies are best for that student to have access to the same learning opportunities and to demonstrate that they know and have mastered the material that their normal hearing peers do. So you will look at the accommodation categories of instructional strategies, what can the teacher do, time and scheduling of their classes and their tests, just the physical environment of the classroom. You'll look at hearing assistive equipment, not just the hearing aids and the cochlear implants, but also other assistive technologies such as FM systems. So let's start with the instructional strategies. What are some instructional strategies that teachers can actually utilize in the classroom that may provide supplemental access to the student with hearing loss? You can always use and should use the use of visual supplements, from PowerPoints to actually hands-on models to whiteboards, smart boards, even overheads, any type of chart, things that are written down where they can have visual access as well as that auditory access. Because remember, the auditory signal may still be degraded even though they're wearing their hearing aids and an FM system. Vocabulary lists can be written down and given ahead of time. Lecture outlines where the student can follow along and just make their own notes if this is an older student that you're working with. Of course, writing information on the board. However, do note that when you are turned around writing on the board, if you still lecture, the student no longer has access to looking at the visual cues of the face. So whatever you could write on the board before that class begins would be optimal for that student. Things even like written copies of school announcements that they would be making through the intercom. That's difficult for many hard of hearing children to hear and access. So to have those ahead of time so that they can take them home and they will know what to expect that's coming up. Captioning and scripts for either TV, videos, or YouTube are something that's often quite necessary since they do have a degraded signal. Watching YouTube, watching the TV or the videos makes it that much more difficult to hear and understand. We recommend a buddy system. For example, if you have a child in the first grade if he has a buddy that can kind of also point out time to line up, time to go here, we're sitting here for lunch, and just him to have a person he can follow around is very helpful. If you have a strong student who's trustworthy, that's a good solid note taker, and you're working with an older student that has a hearing loss, they can also be the note taker for that child. In college, we often assign note takers for students that have accommodation. Sometimes there may be the necessity for extra explanations and further directions. You can check for understanding of the instruction, and if they did not understand quite well, you can go ahead and repeat what you said, or you can break down the instructions into simpler components. Always obtain the student's attention prior to speaking to ensure that they are looking at you, they are attending to you, and they know that you're about to share information with them. Repeat or rephrase as needed. If they do not understand what you said with the first repeat, I recommend rephrasing the word. It could be that you're using sounds that they do not have access to, like soft sounds like the S. However, when you rephrase the word, you may use different sounds and they can hear that just fine. And then, of course, if the student is deaf and in the classroom, use the interpreter. When you are using an interpreter in the classroom and you're speaking to the student, always look at the student. Do not look at the interpreter and say, tell this student such and such. Just talk directly to the student, and the interpreter will interpret exactly what you're saying. Other teaching tips just to keep in mind when you're teaching a class that has a child who has hearing loss. Avoid talking to the class while you're facing the board. Number one, you've deflected all of the sound behind you. I mean, you're talking to the board, and the child does not have access to your face, nor will he be able to hear the signal as well. When you're in class and you may be doing some table work, indicate who's talking at the moment, or even speaker cues in the classroom, such as, yes, Billy, what would you like to say about that? And then when Billy talks, repeat Billy's comment. If you are wearing an FM system, be mindful, like we talked about in the last module, that only your voice can be heard by that student and not necessarily the other students' voices at that moment with most FM systems. So indicate who's talking, then repeat their comment or repeat their questions before even answering the question. Do use teacher cues, cueing the topic and topic changes. All right, class, we just got finished with page 25. Let's close our book now and turn to this. All right, class, we have finished up talking about addition. Now we're going to move to subtraction. So make sure that you have very marked cues when you're changing topics. When you're using new vocabulary and teaching new concepts, if you pre-teach the concepts and vocabulary words ahead of time before you present it even to the whole class. For example, if you have new spelling words given on Tuesday, perhaps Monday in class, you can go over quickly those spelling words with the child, give him a handout with those spelling words on them, let his parents work with them overnight, then introduce everything in class the next day. This is pre-teaching is a very powerful teaching instructional strategy that truly helps the child understand and retain new information. The next category of accommodations we will look at are time and scheduling of classes and material and break time. So do understand that with a child who has hearing loss, listening through the hearing aid with a degraded signal can be very fatiguing, and they can experience that auditory fatigue and become tired over time. It's necessary to have some downtime and just break from listening. I know one student in the classroom, we let them leave 3 minutes early from one class and come in 2 minutes late for the next class so that he could go into the bathroom and just get a break to himself. And he would lock himself in the stall for about 5 minutes and just get that quiet time, recalibrate, get himself together, and go on to the next class. Also, they may need extra time to complete assignments. One thing that we try to do is schedule the core subjects, math, English, reading, in the morning when they're more focused and they have more energy versus in the late afternoon when they're tired of listening all day long. Also, if you can give tests in a quiet area, and sometimes extended time is required for these tests, it keeps distractions out and helps them maintain focus. Our last category are the accommodations for the physical and acoustical environment. This also includes some of the amplification options that we have talked about. In the physical environment, if you have a deaf or hard of hearing child that needs equal access to all other information that the normal hearing students have, flashing alarms in the hallways or in the classrooms are necessary. You would like to incorporate preferential seating. Most people think of preferential seating as front row seating. However, if in the classroom you have the classroom arrangement in semicircles or pods or centers set up throughout the classroom, you would want the child to be closest to the teacher where you typically teach from. But also preferential seating can be dependent upon the child. For example, I have one middle schooler who prefers to sit in the second row. The reason he wants the second row is that he's close enough to the teacher so that he can see what's going on, he can hear her better, but he's also behind the child so that if he misses something, and he has a fairly significant hearing loss, he can watch and see what the other child is doing. So he can see if the child is putting up one book and getting out another book, or flipping to a different chapter or a different page. So he prefers second row seating, and we absolutely permit that for him. Other accommodations that can be made to the acoustic environment is absolutely incorporate the child's personal amplification, be that a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. Make sure that the child has the bilateral amplifications necessary for him. That would be recommended by the audiologist. That they are all working. We've done the troubleshooting for the hearing aids and the cochlear implants. And you also incorporate any type of personal FM device. You would be wearing the microphone and the child would have the receiver. However that device works, be sure that you use that and you follow the instructions that we've already discussed in the previous module. Some classrooms are very noisy. There's quite a great deal of reverberation going on. So you can acoustically treat the classroom environment using rugs, carpet squares. Many carpet stores will just give leftover scraps to teachers to put down where they can have their desks on top of that. You can put bulletin boards that help absorb reverberating sound. Curtains also help absorb sound. If you have chairs or tables, you can put tennis balls on the bottoms of those. That keeps them from squeaking when moved, and it also helps to absorb sound. For some children with hearing loss, they may need a little bit more than just the accommodations we have talked about. There may be some modifications that would be made to the content, to the instruction, or to how they would demonstrate their learning. There are a few categories that we would think about with this. General categories that we look at when making modifications would be changes to the instructional level, changes to the actual content, or even changes to the performance criteria. Some modifications that we can discuss would be, for example, a shortened spelling list or a shortened test. You may use only half of the words for the week with this child rather than the full list that you would use for the rest of the class. Perhaps you would use a multiple choice of spelling words instead of saying, please spell the word cantaloupe, because they cannot perceive every phoneme. Instead, you would use a multiple choice and you would say cantaloupe, but then you would have others that were misspelled and let him choose the correct spelling for cantaloupe. You could pre-tutor the vocabulary. We discussed this in our last module of accommodations. You would pre-tutor the vocabulary, let the parents go over that at night, and then introduce new vocabulary with all the new phonemes the next day. At Ole Miss, we allow in the College of Liberal Arts and the School of Applied Sciences people that have hearing loss to take an alternative to a foreign language, so they can choose, rather than taking Spanish or French where they have a degraded signal and may not perceive that phoneme accurately, to take sign language. Other schools may allow to take computer science or a different type of course rather than the foreign language. Another modification that can be made would be modifying the actual reading assignment. Perhaps you would shorten the length of the reading assignment, or you may either adapt or eliminate any type of phonics assignments where they have to rely on sounding out letters and sounding out words. Perhaps you would need to modify written assignments by shortening the length or even adjusting the evaluation criteria, making it slightly different for the child with hearing loss than you do for the rest of the class. Some students that are deaf and hard of hearing may be on an alternative curriculum than the other peers. Another modification is that you could reduce the quantity of tests or use alternative tests. For example, instead of an auditory lab test where they have to listen underneath headphones, you may give a written test where they can just use visual input. You may need to provide reading assistance with the test if they're not able to sound out the words or the letters, or give length and time for tests. So all of these are modifications that you are modifying your instruction or the content or even the performance criteria. These modifications are to be made on an individual basis to best meet the needs of that child so he can have access and still participate meaningfully in the classroom.